Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Alina Chan. She is the co-author with Matt Ridley of the new book, or recent book rather, Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. Alina, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So I warned you that guests on this show introduce themselves. You have an impressive resume, but you imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have about a minute to introduce yourself. Please, by all means, introduce yourself.
So I work at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. I engineer vectors for gene therapy. I have a background in biomedicine, in genetic engineering, synthetic biology. And so this whole question of how did the pandemic start? I really only got into it when the pandemic started. So in 2020, I was extremely interested in how this virus might have emerged in Wuhan City. And from there, I kind of caught fame. And since then, people have been coming to me nonstop for the last 3 years, trying to talk to me about the origin of COVID-19 and what the evidence actually tells us.
So if you don't mind, just back up for a moment, because you said you developed you have a doctorate in genetics, I saw you were doing a postdoc at the Broad Institute. Is that still the case? You're on a postdoctoral fellowship there?
Well, now I've gotten promoted, so now I'm a scientific advisor.
Oh, okay. And so, but your doctorate is in genetics, or what? I'm just curious what that specific doctorate was. Where did you get it?
Yes, I got my doctorate in Canada at the University of British Columbia in medical genetics and biochemistry. And so after that, I went to Harvard Medical School to do a postdoc on engineering a human artificial chromosome. And afterwards, I went to the Broad, where I now work on AAVs, adeno-associated viruses, which can be engineered to efficiently deliver gene therapies to patients.
And this is an incredibly promising area of medicine, right? I mean, the ability to, and you and your co-author Matt Ridley have written about this very effectively about, this is an incredibly promising area of medicine. Was that what attracted you to it? I'm just curious. I want to talk about COVID and the origins of COVID-19, of course, but what made you become interested in this field of medicine?
Well, I think I was very much drawn to the idea of being able to re-engineer life. And I don't mean that from a point of view of playing God, but say you take an adeno-associated virus or you take a chromosome from a human and you see, how can I make this something that's useful for treating disease in people? And so we've seen in recent years, especially, that a lot of these AAV-mediated gene therapies have been given approval to treat patients, and
I'm sorry,
many of these patients.
But if you don't mind, give me that acronym again. AAV. What is that again? So, I'm sorry. I want to make sure we're bringing people along and they understand what that means.
Oh yeah, it's adeno-associated virus.
Adeno-associated.
Yes. So these are non-pathogenic, so they don't cause illnesses in people. And you actually find them in most of us. Most of us have been exposed to AAVs without us ever knowing that happened, even from a young age. And so some bottlenecks in this area, being able to deliver gene therapy with these AAVs is overcoming that immune response that normal people have. And so because most of us have been exposed to AAVs, this makes it difficult to deliver the therapy, because when you send the non-pathogenic virus in, the person's immune system responds and makes it much less efficient. So we're looking at ways to modify this vector, this non-pathogenic vector, again, just to emphasize that, so that there's no way that you can cause an outbreak with AAV gene therapy. We're gonna change this, re-engineer it so that it can more efficiently send the gene therapy to parts of your body that need it.
Gotcha. And was this, I'm just curious one more, just on the personal side of this, was this something as a kid you thought about, or was this something that just, was there a moment where you decide, well, I want to be a geneticist and look at genetic therapy and medicine? Was there a moment where you realized this is what I want to do?
Well, I mean, I think I'm a very easygoing person. So I'm not the kind of person who, like, at 5 years old, I'm going to become an astronaut. And then like 30 years later, I'm an astronaut. No, I don't think so. So I always just follow my curiosity. So the thing that's most interesting to me is where I go. And sometimes that gets me into trouble, like this origin of COVID-19 whole topic, because I'm not thinking too long term about, is this good for me or not? Is this question interesting to me right now? And if so, I will pursue it.
Well, and you have, and it's gotten you a lot of controversy, but also it seems to be that now I may be misreading your read on this from the beginning, and now we're 3 years after, almost exactly 3 years after the where we started the lockdowns, and from the beginning you were saying this looks curious, this looks suspicious, that you had a hunch. Now I'm jumping ahead here, that you had a hunch that this was a lab leak early on. So there are two areas that I want to discuss today, if you don't mind. That what caused it, and then was the government reaction the right reaction, right? Because that's been another big focus, not just the origins of COVID, but was the government's response, were the policy responses the right ones? And I think they're two equally important questions to ask, and ones that have not gotten enough attention. I think both, but let's talk about the first one. And you said just recently in a piece in the Spectator, I want to read this if you don't mind. It said it is disheartening that putting people over politics and science, over conspiracy, has come to mean such different things to members of each party. On the Republican side, there is an undeniable keenness to hold accountable scientific and public health leaders who acted in ways that suppressed the lab leak theory. On the Democratic side, there are concerns that an inquiry into these leaders will not be even-handed, and that this will encourage conspiracy theories and deepen the distrust in science, public health, and vaccines. I think that's exactly the right read. That there's been, I don't consider myself a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted, right? But this political divide over this has been very worrisome, and in some ways, has it exacerbated the inquiry into the origins of COVID, do you think, this partisan divide?
Certainly. I mean, this is why, it's been 3 years and there has not yet been a credible investigation. So recently,
is that right? I mean, you said, say that again, because 3 years and no credible investigation. There hasn't, but I guess you're right. There hasn't been a government committee. There's no Warren Commission, right? Which was the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. There's no credible investigation from any government around the world.
As far as I know, there's been none. So, I mean, what we have seen is the World Health Organization got to send about 10 experts into Wuhan City at the beginning of 2021, but that team was completely regulated by the Chinese host. So they were shown only what the Chinese authorities wanted them to see. So, for example, they went to the Wuhan lab, but only to the top biosafety lab, the BSL-4 lab. They weren't shown the lower biosafety labs where actually the SARS-like viruses had been worked with. So, things like that. It's just like they had no ability to go in and investigate. They called it, the World Health Organization called it something like the collaborative journey of discovery or something like that. It was not an inquiry at all. And then we've seen in 2021 later that President Biden instructed the intelligence agencies to provide an assessment on what they thought was more likely a natural, completely natural, let's say wildlife trait origin, or something that came through research activities. So they also classified a field work scientist getting infected by handling bats or animals as a lab origin. So all of the about 8 agencies looked at this, and till today, 4 of them rule that it's natural with low confidence. One is the FBI that says that it's more likely a lab leak with moderate confidence. The other is the DOE, Department of Energy, that says it's a lab, more likely a lab with low confidence. And 2, which include the CIA, say they don't know.
Well, and the DOE report is among the latest, right? Which is an interesting one, that it would be coming from that agency of all the agencies in the world, right? That this is an energy department, an energy agency paying attention to this, but they have great computational capabilities as well. And I guess from my understanding, they were one of the first to map the genome. It was a DOE project, or I may have my history on that incorrect. But how would you describe, I mean, and I know I don't want to get too far into this, but you addressed the politics of this in your Spectator piece. How do you describe your politics?
Well, I mean, so my politics are not easy to describe, because I grew up in Singapore as a child and in my early teens, and then I moved back to Canada where I was born. So I can't really say...
So you were born in Canada, your folks moved to Singapore, and then they moved back to Canada. And then did you grow up you went to British school in British Columbia? Or is that where you're from, British Columbia then?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think it'd be easy to, I'm not, like you said, I'm not Democrat or Republican. I don't get to vote. But certainly most of my values are actually extremely liberal. And I'm very pro-science, and I'm of Asian descent. So, I mean, a lot of these labels that were being thrown around, since early 2020 to describe people who asked for an investigation to a lab leak, things like right-wing, racist, conspiracy theorists, like anti-science. None of them stuck onto me because I'm not from that subpopulation.
You don't fit an easy description here, right? About where you lie in terms of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this credibility as a scientist, a PhD with two very prestigious institutions. So, but you also, I mean, in looking at your, how this has evolved from 2021, I saw that you had been told, you posted on Twitter that you were planning to change your name. You wrote, "I'm going to read this. I've been warned by friends and family that I've ended my career or can't travel safely under my real name anymore." And then you wrote that some people had even suggested you get a gun permit. I mean, I'm just reading from your own Twitter account, which, by the way, is at AYJ Chan. I guess I had this question for later, but I want to put it to you now since we brought it up. But how has this changed you? Because you've gone from I don't want to overestimate, or maybe I'm overstating that, but someone who is viewed as part of the fringe or, not credible, to now suddenly where you started is where a lot of people are coming to rest. Is that, so let me ask that question. How has it changed you?
The whole process? Well, I mean, it's been a really unpredictable ride with lots of highs and lows, extreme highs and extreme lows. I mean, there's been scary stuff, but also moments of great like encouragement. Just seeing a lot of courageous people, scientists, journalists, sleuths, like internet detectives, like people who find the courage to say, "I'm gonna dig into this. I'm gonna see what evidence is available." And then I'm gonna share it. So people do this at great risk to their careers, especially the scientists, to their safety. Like everyone is, of course, like if you're looking into the lab origin, you could very plausibly become a target of the Chinese government. And now that this issue has also become politicized, that there are really high stakes at hand. So I'd say that it's been incredible. I mean, when I started this in early 2020, I had no idea that, that in the background at that time, there had been top scientific leaders discussing how to shut down a lab origin of COVID-19, discussing behind closed doors and private calls, how can we best tell the public that there's no way this came from a lab. So
some of this is the Twitter files, and some of this is other investigations. Now the House investigations, other sources of information that's dribbling out. Well, so you mentioned, the possibility of retribution from the Chinese government or someone else, but has that eased now that your early hypothesis become more mainstream?
No, I don't think so. If anything, I think it might have gotten worse. So even though now almost everybody acknowledges that a lab origin is on the table and should be investigated, the backlash and the criticism of those people like me who first proposed looking into lab origin has gotten worse and worse. So the name calling has gotten worse. The threats are terrible. I mean, they haven't, no one has turned around and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for treating you like that" in 2020. Like they've just dug in deeper.
And how do you attribute that? I mean, is this, it seems an almost, when you're saying this, I'm thinking you're talking about virology and origin of COVID, but some of this echoes what, the debate over climate change, right? That some scientists, that they're taking a counter position, that it's a risk their career kind of move. And because of, there's a lot of groupthink. There's a lot of groupthink in general in society. But I have to ask the question about, particularly for people who are in the American government, U.S. government, that a lab leak, if that was the case, that would be very unfortunate for them, because it's clear that the U.S. was helping fund some of the research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? So was this an inconvenient truth, to use an old phrase or old title? Was this an inconvenient truth for people like Anthony Fauci and others who are in the powers that be in the genetics and virology world? Was this an inconvenient truth that the lab leak could be a real possibility?
Yes, I think this is precisely right. So, I mean, this Virology Institute in Wuhan was especially collaborative. So they had many partnerships, not just with the US, but all over the world, including in other parts of Asia and in Europe. So for all these collaborators who had worked with these scientists on SARS-like viruses, had given them money, had encouraged them, had, been very friendly with them at conferences and things like that, to suddenly think that maybe they were responsible, directly or indirectly, for an outbreak that's killing millions of people, it's unbelievable. So what do you do in that situation? That you might be really fearful that, if this is true, people will be out for you, like that you might be harassed, or you might be intimidated. So I think, for them, they seem to have the gut reaction of just telling the world it's a conspiracy theory. So don't even look
That
into a lab origin.
That the lab leak was a conspiracy theory, and don't pay attention to any of those people, and in particular Alina Chan, or or other people who were active on Twitter in particular, right? That were saying, no, wait a minute. That and Matt and I talked about some of the other people who were on Twitter that were active in bringing these issues forward. So that that retribution, or that fear of having your being smeared, being threatened, that's been ongoing now for more than 3 years.
Yes, it has been. So I mean, I wish that they had
How
been
do you
more.
How do you deal with it?
Well, I wish that they had been more responsible back then, because that would have actually protected them and protected science. So if they had just come out and said, okay, it might have been an accident, let's investigate. Like even the best scientists have accidents, and let's try and get the data out as much as possible. Try and get like connected to our collaborators in Wuhan, destigmatize it, say that it's not China's fault, even if it came from a lab, because all these scientists around the world are doing similar types of research. That would have de-escalated the tension a lot, prevented this whole thing from being spun as a racist, political conspiracy theory. But here we are 3 years later, and the stakes for this group of scientists, collaborators of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, have just gotten higher and higher, because they put their whole reputation and even their personal safety on this issue.
So they can't. Had they been more humble at the beginning, it might have been a better course of action for them. But now they have to double down, triple down, quadruple down, because of what they've already said, and the possibility that. Well, I mean, I'd be pissed if I found out that the federal U.S. dollars, American dollars, were helping fund the research that ends up with a lab leak for a virus that has killed now 20 million people. What has been the death toll so far?
Yeah, it's an estimated 21 excess deaths, but I think in actual confirmed COVID deaths, I think it's closer to about 6 to 7 million.
6 or 7 million.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the U.S. alone, it's been something like 1 million excess deaths.
Yes,
Is that
more,
right?
More than 1 million confirmed COVID deaths in the U.S.
And I listened to the interview you did with Matt Ridley just recently on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Matt made a good point. He said, if an airplane goes down, if there's an airplane accident, of course we're going to investigate this. But he made the point when I had him on the podcast previously, and he made the point again in that recent podcast in which both of you appeared. He said, the idea that we wouldn't investigate the airplane crash, no one will ever say that. But now there's an attitude of, oh, well, let's not pay attention to the COVID. We don't, the origin of COVID isn't important anymore. We don't need to care about that. And that there's a partisan divide over this, that the left, I'm going to say generally the left, the Democrats are saying, not a big deal, right? And the powers that be in this community saying, in the virology community, oh, not a big deal. But I thought Matt's point about, if you have an airplane accident, of course everyone wants to know what happened. Was it the engine failed? Was it shot down? Assuming you're in agreement with that kind of, like, we have to know what happened. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. So those who oppose a lab origin of COVID-19, there's never a good time to investigate, according to them. So the beginning of the pandemic, they say it's not important to investigate right now because we need to respond to pandemic. So let's not investigate. And then when the pandemic is close to over or dying down, they're like, it's not important anymore. So there's no need to go into this anymore. So there's never a time to investigate. And I think that has, I mean, that reveals their inner dialogue, or their inner ways of shutting down a lab origin. I mean, in the beginning, they shut it down as a conspiracy theory, and now they're telling us it's not important and we'll never find it.
Well, so let's talk about that, because you also said during that same podcast, you said that the lab leak hypothesis, and I'm quoting you, I think directly here, is completely reasonable and non-sensationalist. And more recently, you point out that there are these recent news articles, including one in the Atlantic pointing to raccoon dogs and the wet market. And you said that there's no evidence that viruses were in the market, and that it's also clear that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I'm quoting you almost directly, the lab was engaging in research with low biosafety levels.
Hmm.
And that was I mean, of all the things that I've heard so far, and maybe I read Viral a while ago, so I'm not exactly remembering every detail, but so the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where a lot of this very dangerous research was happening, was actually happening in labs with low biosafety levels.
Yes, it was, and you can see this in the
I mean,
papers that they
that's just
published.
crazy. Sorry, I don't want to get technical. That's crazy town. I mean, it's like, what are you doing? Wait, you're going to play with gasoline and matches, and you're not going to wear a fireproof suit or something? I mean, is that a reasonable way to think about it? Gasoline and matches, that something like this could blow up?
So, I mean, a lot of this is informed based on hindsight, right? So we only the way that we see their research before the pandemic is based on damage done by COVID-19. But if you rewind the clock to early 2019, let's say, um, back then there was no evidence that a bat coronavirus, a SARS-like virus, could jump from a bat to a human and cause an outbreak. There was no evidence that these viruses that were collecting from the wild could spark off a human outbreak. So for them to have to do this work at high biosafety, which would have cost a lot more money and a lot more personnel, would just slow them down. So for these scientists, they would often find other ways to try and de-risk, make the experiment safer. And some of this included working with strains of SARS-like viruses that were very different from the one that caused the 2003 SARS epidemic. So I believe that these scientists were not trying to be reckless with human life. I think that they were trying to do their best in terms of seeing what the risk level was for them. And unfortunately, they misestimated the risk of some of their work.
And therefore, they were working in labs that were not as safe as they should have been.
Yes,
So,
exactly. So the biosafety could not have contained a virus like SARS-CoV-2, the pandemic virus, for a long time.
let me read back what I hear you saying. So are you? If I ask you for a percentage, and you believe that this in fact was a lab leak, are you 90% confident? If I asked you, in that, is there a percentage that you would care to put out there that makes that your confidence level on this?
No, but this question keeps getting asked by journalists and interviewers, and I totally understand it. You want to have an estimate, but the reality is that there's so little evidence available. There hasn't even been a proper investigation to collect all the pieces of evidence pertaining to the origins. So with so little evidence, it's really hard to call percentages, because tomorrow someone could do an investigation and find email records between the Wuhan scientists and the US collaborators saying, yes, we did the experiment. Then all those people who said it was 99% from the market, it's just gonna be, what are they gonna say?
Okay, well, fair enough. So I'm glad I am asking the most obvious questions. So, you know, every journalist has it. Well, okay, well, but I take your point. But that goes back to your other statement that there has not been a really credible full investigation here, which leads to the obvious question: why hasn't the Chinese government been more? And I know we're in an environment where China bashing. I'm not a China basher. China is going to take care of China. Every country is going to look out after their own best interest, right? That's just a rule, right? Everyone
Yeah.
does what's in their own best interest. Why hasn't the Chinese government been more forthcoming?
Well, I mean, I'd say that the things they've been doing have been all over the map since the beginning of the outbreak. So I mean, until this day, we have no idea who the earliest cases is, and I don't think that there's anyone reasonable who believes that all of the early case data has been shared internationally. I don't think so. We know that in January 2020, the Chinese CDC director told the whole world that this virus likely came from illegally sold wildlife at the market. And for a while, that was what everyone believed. There was this whole pangolin frenzy where someone had found a related virus in pangolins, and then the whole world just blew up saying that it must have come from the pangolins. But over time, the available genetic and public health data didn't show that this came from an animal. It looked like the market had been a super spreader event, and it's really difficult to trace because since then the Chinese authorities have decided on an anywhere but China policy. So they don't even want to take responsibility if it came from the market. They don't want the lab. They don't want the market origin. They want it from outside of China origin. So they've been encouraging people to look in Europe, to look in Southeast Asia for the true origin of the virus.
Well, as well as at the University of North Carolina as well, right? This was the
Oh
other
yeah.
one place where there was work on viruses that was occurring, and so that's something else I've seen. And I am not by any means an expert and haven't, honestly followed this that closely aside from reading your book. And by the way, the book is remarkable. And again, just a quick station break. My guest is Alina Chan. She's a scientific advisor at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. She is a virologist, or do you call yourself a
Oh no,
virologist? Or do you,
I'm not an old school virologist, even though I do work with viruses.
a genetic scientist? Would that be, or how do you just what title do you? I call myself a reporter. What do you call yourself?
I mean, I'm a scientist, but nowadays the best science is always interdisciplinary, so it's difficult to put a label on somebody. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, a science generalist, as is Matt Ridley. She is the co-author with Matt Ridley of an excellent book on this called "Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19," which came out. The paperback came out last year, and I had Matt Ridley on the podcast last year to talk about that. Let's talk about Ridley a little bit because I know we both admire him and his work. He tells a remarkable story about how the two of you met, and I could recount it here, but if you don't mind, how did you come to write a book with someone you'd never met?
So in May 2020, I had put out a preprint remarking on how well adapted this virus seemed for the human pandemic, and so today that point is not being disputed by anyone at all. That this any scientist, at least well-known scientists, both on the lab and market origin side, agree that the virus was adapted enough to start a human pandemic from day one. The sequence that we saw that was pandemic ready. So I put that preprint out in May 2020, and Matt Ridley reached out to my author and I to ask questions about the origin. At the time, he was still sold on a market origin. But as time went on and more evidence came out, it became clear that you couldn't determine which was more likely or which was true, the lab or the market origin. And so Matt and I kept chatting, and then at the end of 2020, I think he reached out to me saying that he was going to write a book on this topic, and would I join him as a co-author. So he would bring the skills of a extremely proficient science writer, and I would bring the technical skills as a scientist. I debated for many months on whether to do that, but by my May 2021, we agreed to do it, and that's when we announced that we were going to do Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. But we only met in person close to when the book was launched. So I think it was, if I'm not wrong, around September 2021 was the first time we met in person.
Right. I remember we talked about that. So, what was that like after you'd worked together closely for months on a very technical, very personal project that came with some risk, some reward, but then to meet, I've heard Matt tell the story, but was it like to finally meet him? He's a big, tall guy and an impressive
Yeah.
resume and someone you'd never met, and you work closely for months with him. What was it like to finally meet in person?
He was so much taller than I expected. I mean, I think he was like almost double my height. He was towering over me. Yeah, it was really good. And just Matt is one of the nicest, like most modest people I've ever met, despite his station. Like, he's just a really good person. I mean, I knew that just from working with him as well. I mean, the way that we worked, it was very intense. Like, because of our time differences, it would usually be the way that after work here, I would write nonstop until about 2 or 4 a.m. in the night in Boston, send it back to Matt, where it was about morning his time. He would write like crazy, send it back to me. So that cycle would go on and on for several months until we put the book out in November 2021.
So you wrote the book in less than 6 months.
Yes.
Well, I've done that only once in my career. It was the Enron book, my first book, and I'm not saying that to brag, but it's an incredible amount of effort. And so you're
It
working
is.
7 days a week then.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're just working like crazy. I think I got so little sleep. Like, it's because I was still working at the Broad, so I had to do it outside of my work time. So I mean, that was a huge like marathon slash sprint, just like working around the clock to put everything together. But I think at that point, I had been tweeting about this for about a year already, so I had most of the facts like and citations at my fingertips. So it was really just about getting the writing done. And Matt was incredible in writing the book. I mean, he has so much more expertise and experience than I do, so he guided the writing a lot. Yeah.
Right. But it's one thing to tweet; it's another thing to write a whole chapter or put it together in a book. How important was Twitter? I know. Now I'm testing my memory here. I should have looked back at my notes with when I interviewed Matt. But there was a was it Babar the elephant, or there were other people on Twitter that. Well, let me ask the question directly. How important was Twitter as a platform to for people like you who are saying, okay, what the hell's going on here? How important was Twitter in the early efforts and even today to find the origins of COVID?
I think if Twitter didn't exist, all of these internet detectives, scientists, and journalists wouldn't have found each other and wouldn't have collaborated on looking into evidence related to origins of COVID-19. So without all of that, I think it's possible that even till today, the market origin would have remained the narrative, remained the public consensus on how this pandemic started. So I think
Which
Twitter,
is not the full story. So to put it another way, is that Twitter provided a forum where there was an alternative views were allowed and
yes,
not
yeah.
suppressed, although it became involved in suppression of other things later. But it also was the place where you met Ridley, right? Which was so as a place where you're finding original research and that things of consequence occur that in terms of furthering debate, then is it fair to say that Twitter's become an indispensable part of this public debate?
Yes, it has been. So I mean, there's so much less censorship on Twitter than there is in other forms of media and social networking. So I mean, even amongst scientists, I think there has been a lot of censorship, not just self-censorship, but a lot of gatekeeping amongst the journals to prevent things that prevent opinions, prevent reviews, and analysis pointing to a possible lab origin of COVID-19.
So were you surprised? Because I was a little surprised about this latest story about the raccoon dog as a possible origin. Now, 3 years after the pangolin, we have another animal candidate come forward. And again, I'm not, I'm using the shorthand here because I don't fully understand all the science. But was it surprising for you to see yet another animal origin hypothesis come out of, I'm not going to say left field, but unexpectedly, it seems to me, to now 3 years later, that's, oh, here's another possibility. Were you surprised to see that? And did you immediately dismiss it?
No, I was not surprised because it has been a single group, a small group of virologists and friends who have been throwing all these balls at the wall every few months. So I mean, it has been the same group of scientists who met in February 2020, freaking out about possible lab origin, but put out proximal origins, a seminal letter in Nature Medicine that shut down all lab-based scenarios. And since then, every year or every few months, they'll be throwing out a new hypothesis saying that there's no way this came from a lab. It must have come from the market. So, I mean, for example, in 2021, they were telling us that the virus jumped from animal to people at multiple markets. But today they're telling us, no, it was that one raccoon dog stall where it jumped multiple times into people. So, I mean, they just can't make up their minds.
Well, and you pointed out it was on Twitter in the last couple of days that something like 16% of all the samples that were taken in the wet market came from one raccoon dog stall, which, I mean, is an interesting kind of number just by itself, right? Well, why would they take so many samples from just one spot? I mean, it would seem like you could do with a few fewer samples from one place, right? You want to spread out the samples. Why did you feel the need to underscore that, I mean, because, I mean, you're talking about so many different data points, right? And trying to investigate all this. And why was that important to you to point out, well, why are they making so many samples from this one place?
Well, I mean, I think that okay, so let me rephrase that. So the Chinese CDC heard about these early cases, only a handful of early cases that were linked to the market. And so back in 2019, December 2019, they were fairly convinced that this was SARS 2003 happening again. So they ran to the market and they took samples aggressively from stalls that sold wildlife, including this one stall that one virologist had taken a photo of a raccoon dog at in 2014. So out of the 1,300 plus samples that they took at the market, about 1 in 6 was taken from this stall or its warehouse, because they truly thought that they were on the search for an intermediate host, an animal that caused a pandemic again.
Right.
So I don't think that anyone can really fault them for that. It's only on hindsight that we think you should have taken, an even number of samples across all 678 stalls at the market. But putting yourself in their shoes back in December 2019, you're on the hunt to find the source of this virus and to stamp it out so it doesn't keep causing more outbreaks. So
Right.
would you take only 10 samples per store, or would you actually take hundreds of samples from the wildlife store that you thought was suspicious, which clearly they did?
And so that was the hypothesis at the moment that they said, oh, well, it's probably from here. So let's really focus some of our a lot of our effort here. So, well, let me ask this, shift a little bit because we've talked about, I said two broad areas of questions I wanted to talk about. What caused it? And then was the government reaction correct? And responsible. And now we're finding a lot of effort from the Twitter files. And in fact, there was a lot of suppression of information about efficacy of masks and vaccines, et cetera. I've been vaccinated 3 times. Did you get vaccinated?
Oh yeah, and boosted. Yeah.
And boosted? But then I knew, people who didn't, and still, some high profile people like, athletes, right? So this was, were you surprised? Matt and I talked about this, about how quickly the U.S. was able to develop a vaccine, an effective vaccine, which I'm testing or showing my scientific ignorance, but was developed with mRNA and came out within, just really hours or days of once they figured out what the genetic makeup of the virus was. Were you surprised? This is your field, right? Of anti-adeno, ADENO. I just looked it up. Anti-adeno viruses. Do I have this right? Did I get it right?
Uh, Adeno-associated viruses.
Adeno-associated viruses. Forgive
Yeah.
me. Adeno-associated, ADENO, adeno-associated viruses. Were you surprised how quickly that the U.S. and these big pharma companies were able to come up with an effective vaccine?
I'm not too surprised because as time passes, you expect technology to get better, and that includes biotechnologies. So in the past, it would take months just to sequence one genome of a coronavirus. So in 2003, for example, it took at least 2 months to put together the genome of that SARS virus. But today, you can do it in like 5 hours. So uh, in the same way, vaccine technologies have improved. So now you don't need to take months to make an inactivated virus vaccine. You can just make a mRNA vaccine within weeks. So actually within possibly days using the available technology. So
Well,
it's just so much
in
faster.
days, wasn't it? It was within like 48 hours or 72 hours. It was just a very, I'm testing my memory here, but it was very short. Less than a week, as I recall.
I think they're taken like some days to design the vaccine, but to produce it probably takes days to weeks. Okay, I'm not the vaccine producer, so you probably have to ask them.
No problem.
Yeah, but yes, they responded very quickly, and so this old mentality of we need to go out there and hunt various viruses, find all the viruses in the wild, and to make vaccines for all of those, I think that has been outpaced by current vaccine technologies, because now surveillance is clearly the answer. So you just want to be testing human populations like airports, areas near labs, public areas where you expect a lot of disease spread. And the moment you find a new virus or pathogen spreading amongst people, that's when you quickly launch your vaccine production. I don't think the old way of trying to make a vaccine for the thousands of viruses you found in nature is the way anymore.
So it's going to be, well, now we've identified it and we're going to make a custom vaccine for this new pathogen because we can do it quickly, right? So why haven't the
Yes,
Chinese
exactly.
vaccines been effective?
Well, let's not venture into that. I think I have not looked at the data for the Chinese vaccines, so I don't think I am in a position to judge them. Yeah.
Fair enough. So you grew up in Singapore, but I'm assuming you speak Chinese. Is that am I making the correct assumption?
Yes, it's my second language actually. Yeah.
Your second language after English?
Yes.
So was that, by being able to speak Chinese, how did that help you, I guess, would be the most, how did that help you in becoming, sleuthing out these issues? Was that, in your experience in Singapore? You mentioned being raised in Singapore, and the Singaporean government is famously restrictive, I guess would be, or very active monitoring of their population. How did that affect you? That though both your language capability and being from Singapore, how did that prepare you to investigate this?
Well, I'd say that most of the news reporting and the documents related to origins of COVID-19 are written in Chinese, or there are videos that are interviews in Chinese. So if you don't speak or read Chinese, I'd say that there's a massive barrier to understanding whether the translations are accurate or whether the people who are giving you the translations know what they're saying. So being able to read and to speak Chinese helped me a lot. I think politically, I haven't let any of that really interfere with my analysis of the available evidence, because I just look at what is there scientifically. So I don't try to say like this means that I can't trust this government or that kind of thing. I just see what is the available data, what's missing.
So, well, this is an obvious question too, and but I'll ask it because he's been vilified by a lot of people. What do you think of Anthony? This is part of this follow up on this. Was the government's reaction correct? Right, and I think pushing for vaccination, that made sense to me. Masking, well, maybe not so much. I was in Japan a few weeks ago, and the Japanese were still wearing masks outside, and I was like, what are you doing? It made no sense to me on any kind of level. But the Japanese are very, they're very culturally attuned. They're very homogeneous. They're very much, concerned about other people. The short question is, what do you think of Anthony Fauci? Has his reaction and public announcements on this been aligned with how you think he should have talked about these issues?
Well, I think that he is in a really difficult situation because he directed the NIAID, which provided funding that made its way to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So for him in early 2020 to realize that maybe some of the money from his agency had funded research that caused the pandemic, that was a terrifying situation to be in. So we know that he was part of a private phone call involving many top scientists around the world, mostly based in the US or in Europe, who had advocated for risky virus research. So advocated for research where you could potentially enhance human pathogens or animal viruses in the lab. And so in this situation, they were saying, how likely is it that this came from that lab? And one person, the director of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, said it's the Wild West there in China. So they have no idea what they could have done. They might have enhanced the virus. They might have put it through serial passage, causing it to adapt for human spreading. So for them, this was a real problem. And fast forward to today, you see that Dr. Fauci is telling journalists that he has a very open mind, that he has never ruled out the lab origin. So for me, I think let's investigate. Let's pull out all the stops. Let's investigate everything here outside of China that is possible to investigate and see what we can find about the research that was ongoing in Wuhan before the pandemic, and whether that leads us to a lab origin.
So that's your bottom line, that we need to investigate, and no matter where it leads, that this is what you've been saying for now 3 years. Is that a fair assessment of your take on all of this? But
yes, I think it's unfair to.
But go ahead. Well,
I think it's unfair to both sides unless we do an investigation. So let's find all the evidence we can find first, and then afterwards we can say was the way that you behaved in early 2020 the appropriate way.
So a couple of quick questions, because I know you've got to run and you've got that full life that goes beyond my podcast.
Sorry.
No problem. Were the lockdowns necessary
in China?
The lockdowns in response to the virus, were they appropriate? Were the lockdowns were they necessary?
I think this is a honestly very difficult question, because even the airborne transmission of the virus was not acknowledged till quite late in the pandemic. So we only slowly accepted, by we I mean public health people, experts, only slowly accepted the fact that this virus was spreading through the air. That you just had to be in the same room as someone to catch it, that you didn't need to be standing face to face with them and then talking and breathing on each other. So in that situation, if we had acknowledged that sooner, there could have been many ways to mitigate the spread of this virus without lockdowns. But the problem is that we didn't even acknowledge airborne transmission. So in that case, a lot of experts recommended lockdowns.
And so, well, if the way you're saying that, then there was some reason for masking. That masking did. Then is it fair to say then, if that was the case, that masks were in some cases justified?
Yeah, not just masks, but I mean, if you work in a hospital or in the service, like a people-facing position, there's so many ways to prevent spreading airborne spreading, and one is ventilation, and that's been a big message by the people who gathered the evidence for airborne transmission, is that if you improve the ventilation in any space, that prevents the spreading dramatically. So having windows open, whether in the school, having fans, making sure the ventilation is not causing all the virus to be concentrated in spaces, that dramatically reduces the rate of transmission.
Well, and just one thing that reaction is that the flight attendants even had a lower rate of transmission or lower rate of infection than the general public. And they're in small confined spaces, but there's good ventilation on jetliners. So there was, I mean, just one of the indicators. So I know you have to go, so I'm just going to make sure I ask these questions of you because I ask them of all my guests. So, before I get to those, so are you working on another book now? Do you have another project that's on the table now with Matt or someone else?
No. So, I mean, in 2021, when we published the book, I really thought that a real investigation was going to start immediately, but it didn't. So it kind of dragged out till today, where finally there is a congressional inquiry that's being launched. But I also have no idea where that will go and whether it will look into the most productive sources or information. So for me, I have no plans to update the book, but perhaps if the origin is found, then we will, of course, write an update.
Are you pleased with how Viral has sold, or do you know how many copies it's sold?
No, I haven't been tracking them. I mean, I think that the publishers have been great, and our agent has been great. They've been sending me reports, but I haven't had time to look at them.
Gotcha. So my last two questions, and again, my guest is Alina Chan. You can find her on Twitter at AYJChan. What are you reading these days? I know you have other obligations between work and family. What's on your bookshelf, or what's on the top of your list these days?
I mean, I'm so busy at work that I've mainly just been reading the scientific literature. So I haven't had much time to read non-scientific literature.
Fair enough. So no Tom Clancy novels then, I'm guessing.
No.
So you've gone through a lot, and you've made that clear about your own personal, sacrifice, right? And your own concerns for your own personal safety and threats and things that have come your way. You've been through a lot over the last 3 years. What gives you hope?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I have to have that much time to pause and think about hope, but I think I've certainly been encouraged by other scientists and journalists and internet detectives that continue to look at the evidence. So I think that there are people who are really determined, and they're not going to be stopped.
And so that hope is that the scientific inquiry will continue. I mean, I don't want to paraphrase what you're saying here, or maybe I do, but that hope is that the truth will out?
Yes, that's a hope. Yep.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to stop then. So my guest has been Alina Chan. She's the co-author with Matt Ridley of a very good book called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. She's a scientific advisor at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and you can find her on Twitter at AYJChan. Alina, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thanks, Robert.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Tune into the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.